Kethva pressed his forefingers against the cold metal of the communications console as the emergency signal crackled through the speakers of the Zephyrian command ship. The message came from the Outer Rim colonies and carried the same desperate tone that had haunted their military frequencies for 3 long months. Another system had fallen to the Void Swarm, another billion lives consumed by the biomechanical horrors that swept through space like a plague of living darkness. The tactical officer's blue-scaled skin shifted to a deeper shade of purple, a natural response his species showed when faced with extreme stress. Around him, the bridge crew of the Zaz Harmony moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had grown accustomed to receiving bad news. Captain Zelka, a veteran of 12 different conflicts, maintained her composure as she reviewed the data streaming from the fallen colony of Nexus Prime. "How many ships did they have defending the system?" Kethva asked, though he already knew the answer would not bring comfort. The Zephyrian Alliance had been throwing their best technology at the swarm for months, watching their most advanced vessels disappear into the writhing mass of organic metal and living machinery that devoured everything in its path. 3 battle cruisers and a full defensive grid, Captain Zelka replied, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated losses. They lasted 4 hours longer than Kepler Station, but the result was the same. The swarm adapts to our weapons faster than we can develop new ones. Kethva had studied the tactical reports from every encounter with the enemy. The Void Swarm operated unlike any threat the galaxy had ever faced. Their ships were not built but grown, massive creatures that could repair damage in real time and evolve new defenses against whatever weapons struck them. The Alliance's energy-based weaponry, considered the pinnacle of military technology, proved increasingly useless as the creatures developed immunity to plasma discharge and particle beams. The communications officer, a young Zephyrian named Tunda, raised her head from her station with an expression of confusion. "Captain, I'm receiving a response to our distress beacon. The signal is coming from the Sol System." A strange silence fell over the bridge. The Sol System was home to the humans, a relatively new species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, still relying on fusion reactors and kinetic projectiles while most civilizations had moved beyond such crude methods millennia ago. "Are you certain about the origin?" Captain Zelka asked, her tone suggesting she hoped for an error in the readings. "Confirmed, Captain. The signal identifies itself as coming from the United Earthship Discovery under the command of Captain Lisa Morgan. They are requesting permission to assist in our defense against the Void Swarm threat." Kethva accessed his personal database of known military capabilities among the various species of the galaxy. The humans ranked near the bottom of most tactical assessments. Their weapons considered outdated and their ships built with materials that more advanced civilizations had abandoned centuries ago. Their military doctrine was equally primitive, focusing on direct confrontation rather than the sophisticated energy manipulation techniques that define modern warfare. What could they possibly offer against an enemy that has defeated our most advanced fleets? Kethva muttered, more to himself than to his fellow officers. The answer came 3 hours later, when the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Kethva watched the scanner displays with growing bewilderment as 3 human vessels appeared on their screens. The ships were smaller than typical Alliance battle cruisers and constructed with a blocky, utilitarian design that prioritized function over the elegant curves preferred by more aesthetic civilizations, Captain. Morgan's voice came through the communication system with an accent that Kethva's translator struggled to render properly. "This is the UES Discovery requesting permission to join the defensive formation. We've brought some friends who are eager to help with your swarm problem." The other 2 ships identified themselves as the UES Relentance under Commander Danny Foster and the UES Defiance commanded by Captain Amy Rodriguez. Their casual tone when discussing the threat that had terrorized the galaxy struck Kethva as either incredibly brave or dangerously ignorant. Admiral Carlos Rivera's authorization came through official channels within the hour, granting the human fleet permission to participate in the defense of Zephyrian space. The decision sparked heated debate among the Alliance command structure, with many officers questioning the wisdom of involving such a technologically inferior species in their desperate struggle for survival. HFY found himself assigned as a liaison to the human fleet, a position that would require him to coordinate between the advanced tactical systems of the Alliance and whatever primitive communication methods the humans employed. As his shuttle approached the UES Defiance, he observed the human ship's construction more closely through the viewports. The hull was thick and angular, designed to absorb punishment rather than deflect it like Alliance vessels. Weapon ports dotted the surface in seemingly random patterns, housing projectile launchers instead of the refined energy weapons that define civilized warfare. The ship looked more like a flying fortress than the sleek instrument of war that military doctrine suggested for space combat. Captain Rodriguez greeted HFY in the docking bay with a firm handshake, a human custom that his briefing materials had mentioned but failed to adequately prepare him for. Her grip was stronger than expected, and her eyes held a quality that HFY had not encountered in other species. There was no fear in her expression despite knowing what they would soon face, only a calm determination that seemed almost predatory. In its intensity, welcome aboard, HFY. We're honored to fight alongside the Zephyrian Alliance. Our crews are ready to show these swarm creatures what happens when they threaten innocent lives. The confidence in her voice unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The first sign of the Void Swarm's arrival came as a distortion in space itself, a ripple in the fabric of reality that made every sensor on the combined fleet scream warnings into the darkness. HFY watched from the bridge of the UES Defiance, as the humans around him responded to the threat with a calmness that defied all logic. While Zephyrian crews across the fleet began their standard defensive protocols, the human officers continued their casual conversations as if they were discussing the weather rather than facing an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. Captain Rodriguez stood at the center of the bridge with her arms crossed, studying the tactical display that showed massive shapes emerging from the void between stars. The bioships of the swarm dwarfed even the largest Alliance vessels, their organic hulls pulsing with veins of corrupted energy that seemed to drain light from the surrounding space. Each creature was unique, evolved for a specific purpose in the swarm's relentless advance across the galaxy. "Well, they're certainly ugly," commented Lieutenant Jake Harrison from his position at the weapons console, his tone carrying the same casual indifference that HFY had noticed among all the humans since his arrival. The observation struck the Zephyrian officer as completely inappropriate given the magnitude of the threat they faced, the largest of the swarm. Vessels stretched across several kilometers of space, its surface covered in writhing tentacles that could tear through reinforced armor plating like cloth. Smaller creatures swarmed around it, darting through space with movements that seemed to defy the basic principles of physics. These were the same horrors that had shattered Alliance battle lines and consumed the populations of entire worlds. "Enemy contacts are moving into attack formation," reported Chief Petty Officer Lisa Adams from her station. "Estimate 47 large bioships and over 300 smaller attack forms." HFY felt his species' natural fear response trigger as the psychic emanations from the swarm washed over their position. The creatures broadcasted terror as a weapon, projecting waves of primal horror that could paralyze most sentient beings. He had read reports of entire crews freezing at their posts when exposed to the swarm's mental assault, unable to function as their minds recoiled from the alien wrongness that these creatures represented. The humans showed no such reaction. If anything, their behavior became more focused as the enemy approached, but HFY detected no increase in stress or fear among the crew. They continued working with the same steady efficiency they had displayed during routine operations, as if the approaching nightmare was simply another problem to be solved through proper application of violence. "Commander Foster is requesting permission to engage," reported the communications officer, a young woman whose name tag read Mitchell. "He wants to take the Relentless in for a close-range attack run." Captain Rodriguez nodded approval without hesitation. Tell Danny he's cleared for attack pattern Alpha. Amy Chun, signal the Discovery to begin their diversionary maneuver. We'll give the Alliance fleet time to get into position. Kethva watched in disbelief as the UES Relentless broke formation and accelerated directly toward the largest swarm bioship. Every tactical manual in the Alliance database emphasized the importance of maintaining maximum engagement distance. When facing the Void Swarm, their tentacles could extend across thousands of meters, and their bioweapons became exponentially more dangerous at close range. "Captain," Kethva said, his voice carrying the stress that human crews seemed immune to, "Commander Foster is violating basic engagement protocols. The swarm's close-range capabilities are documented to be overwhelming against energy weapons." Rodriguez interrupted, completing his sentence with a smile that Kethva found disturbing in its confidence. "But we don't use energy weapons, do we?" The human destroyer opened fire while still accelerating toward its target, launching a barrage of what appeared to be simple kinetic projectiles. Kethva's enhanced vision allowed him to observe the impact pattern as the slugs struck the bioship's organic armor. Instead of bouncing harmlessly off the adaptive hull like Alliance energy blasts had done in previous encounters, the kinetic rounds punched through the creature's defenses and detonated deep within its body cavity. The bioship's reaction was immediate and violent. Its entire hull convulsed as secondary explosions rippled through its organic structure, and several of its major tentacles went limp as critical neural pathways were severed. For the first time since the swarm had appeared in Alliance space, one of their major vessels showed actual signs of significant damage from the opening attack. "Nuclear-tipped penetrator rounds," Lieutenant Harrison explained to Kethva without taking his eyes off his targeting display. "The swarm's bio-armor evolved to disperse energy attacks, but it can't adapt fast enough to absorb the kinetic impact of a tungsten spike moving at a significant fraction of light speed." The revelation struck Kethva like a physical blow. The Alliance had spent months trying increasingly sophisticated energy-based solutions to the swarm problem, developing new particle beam configurations and plasma frequencies in an attempt to find something the creatures couldn't adapt to resist. The humans had approached the same problem from the opposite direction, using weapons so primitive that the swarm's evolutionary responses were useless against them. Commander Foster's destroyer continued its attack run, diving between the wounded bioship's flailing tentacles while launching more kinetic rounds into vital areas that his targeting computers had identified. The human ship moved with an agility that seemed impossible given its blocky construction. Dancing through counterattacks that should have been impossible to avoid, the wounded swarm creature attempted to bring its bioweapons to bear, spraying streams of corrosive fluid that had dissolved Alliance vessels in previous battles. The Relentless weathered the attack with damage that would have been catastrophic to any other ship, but the human destroyer's thick armor plating absorbed the assault while Foster pressed his attack. "Armor breach on decks 4 through 7. Reported a damage control officer whose voice remained steady despite the severity of the situation. "Hull integrity at 67% and falling." "Noted." Foster's voice came through the communication system with the same casual tone he might use to acknowledge a minor inconvenience. "We'll finish this pass and then fall back for repairs." The destroyer's final salvo struck the bioships central core, and the massive creature's death throes sent shock waves through space that every ship in the area could feel. As the swarm vessel collapsed in on itself, its smaller escort creatures began converging on the Relentless with movements that radiated fury and hunger. "Captain." Rodriguez activated the fleet communication system and spoke in a voice that carried across every human ship in the formation. "All vessels, the enemy is committed to their attack pattern. Execute Battle Plan Delta and show these things what happens when they threaten human space." The 3 human ships scattered in different directions, abandoning any pretense of maintaining formation as they engaged individual swarm creatures with tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They used their own vessels as weapons when necessary, ramming bioships too large to destroy with conventional attacks while their crews laughed and shouted battle cries that Kethva's translator couldn't properly render, watching the humans fight was like observing controlled madness in action, a carefully orchestrated chaos that somehow achieved better results than the Alliance's sophisticated tactical doctrines ever had. The battle had raged for 6 hours when the swarm made their most devastating move yet. A massive bioship, larger than any creature previously encountered, materialized at the edge of the system and began disgorging thousands of smaller attack forms. These new variants moved differently than their predecessors, adapting in real time to the kinetic weapons that had proven so effective against their cousins. Kethva observed the tactical situation from his station aboard the UES Defiance and felt his hope drain away like air from a breached hull. The humans had achieved the impossible by actually damaging swarm vessels, but the enemy's response was swift and merciless. The new bioforms demonstrated hardened armor that absorbed kinetic impacts without the catastrophic failures that had marked the earlier engagement. "Their hull composition has changed," reported Lieutenant Harrison as his targeting computers analyzed the new threat. "Density has increased by a factor of 4, and they're showing layered defensive structures that distribute impact energy across multiple sections." Captain Rodriguez studied the evolving tactical situation with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the battle. Around her, the bridge crew continued their work with efficiency that Kethva found disturbing given the deteriorating circumstances. He had expected some sign of concern as their primary weapon advantage evaporated, but the humans showed only increased focus. "Well," Rodriguez said after reviewing the sensor data, "looks like we get to try Plan B." The captain activated ship-wide communications and spoke in a tone that carried to every human vessel in the fleet. "All ships switch to chemical warfare protocols. Deploy the packages we picked up from the Detroit research facility." Kethva felt confusion replace his growing fear as he watched the human ships begin launching what appeared to be standard torpedo salvos toward the approaching swarm forces. The projectiles moved at conventional speeds and showed no signs of the nuclear warheads that had proven so effective in the earlier phases of combat. "Captain," he ventured, "what exactly are chemical warfare protocols in this context?" "Lieutenant." Harrison turned from his station with an expression that Kethva was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. It combined anticipation with something that could only be described as predatory satisfaction. "We're about to introduce the swarm to some friends from Earth's biological warfare research programs." The torpedoes struck their targets and detonated in clouds of what appeared to be simple organic compounds. The swarm bioships continued their advance without apparent concern, their adaptive armor showing no reaction to the chemical dispersal. For several minutes, it seemed as though the human gambit had failed completely. Then the screaming started, the psychic emanations from the swarm. Fleet changed from projected terror to something that Kethva had never heard before in any of the tactical reports. The bioships began convulsing as their organic components were attacked from within by engineered bacteria designed specifically to consume the hybrid flesh-metal composition that formed their hulls. "Modified E. coli variants," Harrison explained, as they watched swarm vessels literally dissolving in space. "Our biowarfare team spent decades developing bacterial strains that could survive in vacuum and consume organic matter at accelerated rates. The swarm's bioarmor makes perfect food for hungry microbes." The human strategy became clear as more bioships succumbed to the bacterial assault. While the Alliance had tried to fight the swarm using increasingly sophisticated technology, humans had approached the problem like exterminators dealing with an infestation. They used the enemy's biological nature against them with weapons that were simultaneously primitive and devastatingly effective, but the swarm's adaptation capabilities proved formidable even against biological attack. Within an hour, new bioforms began appearing that showed immunity to the bacterial weapons. Their hulls had evolved antibiotic compounds that neutralized the engineered organisms before significant damage could occur. "Enemy vessels are developing resistance to biological agents," reported the tactical officer aboard the Discovery. Captain Morgan's response came through the communication system with characteristic human pragmatism. "Noted, all vessels switch to Plan C, deploy the Moscow packages." Kethva was beginning to understand that humans approached warfare like an endless series of escalating problems to be solved. Where other species might retreat when their primary weapons proved ineffective, humans simply moved to the next item on what appeared to be a very long list of increasingly destructive options. The Moscow packages turned out to be something that violated several treaties governing civilized warfare. Instead of targeting the swarm ships directly, the human vessels began deploying what could only be described as space mines filled with radioactive material. The weapons were designed not to destroy enemy vessels, but to contaminate them with radiation that would slowly kill their organic components over time. "Dirty bombs in space," Harrison said when Kethva asked for clarification. "The radiation doesn't care how evolved their armor is. It just sits there and cooks everything biological from the inside out." The tactic proved brutally effective against bioships that had no experience dealing with radiation poisoning. Swarm vessels that had seemed invulnerable to conventional weapons began dying slow, agonizing deaths as their living components succumbed to cellular damage that no amount of evolutionary adaptation could repair quickly enough to matter. What disturbed Kethva most was not the weapons themselves, but the casual way the humans discussed using them. These were tools of mass destruction that could render entire star systems uninhabitable. Yet the human crews talked about radiation weapons the same way Alliance officers might discuss standard torpedo configurations. The battle's turning point came when Commander Foster volunteered his ship for what he called a kinetic conversion maneuver. The plan involved ramming the UES Relentless directly into the largest remaining bioship while detonating the destroyer's fusion reactor at the moment of impact. "You're talking about suicide," Kethva said to Captain Rodriguez as they monitored Foster's approach vector. "Your commander is planning to kill himself and his entire crew." "Danny's planning to take out a target that conventional weapons can't touch," Rodriguez corrected. "The crew voted, and they're all volunteers. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a knight to win the chess game." The destroyer struck its target at near-light speed with a fusion explosion that briefly created a new star in the middle of the battle zone. The massive bioship and everything within 1,000 kilometers simply ceased to exist, vaporized by temperatures that exceeded those found in stellar cores. The remaining swarm vessels began retreating immediately after Foster's sacrifice, their formation breaking apart as individual bioships fled toward the outer system. For the first time in recorded history, the Void Swarm was running from an opponent rather than consuming it. Kethva watched the tactical display update as human pursuit craft began hunting down the fleeing bioforms with systematic efficiency that suggested they had planned for this possibility from the beginning. The pursuit of fleeing swarm vessels led the combined human and Alliance fleet to a discovery that changed everything Kethva thought he understood about warfare. Hidden in the shadow of a dead moon, they found a partially constructed swarm breeding facility, a massive organic structure that served as both factory and nursery for new bioship variants. Captain Rodriguez called it an opportunity that could not be missed. The Alliance commanders called it madness beyond comprehension. The plan she proposed violated every principle of tactical engagement that civilized species had developed over millennia of warfare. "We go in there and capture specimens," Rodriguez explained during the joint command briefing. "Not to destroy them, but to study them while they're still functional. We need to understand how they adapt so quickly to our weapons." Kethva felt his scales shift to their deepest purple shade as he absorbed the implications of what the human captain was suggesting. The breeding facility was not just a target to be eliminated from a safe distance. It was an active, hostile environment filled with creatures designed specifically to consume organic matter and convert it into more swarm bioforms. "Captain," Admiral Valtar of the Alliance fleet interjected, "you are proposing to enter a facility where thousands of Alliance personnel have been processed into enemy biomass. The psychological trauma alone would paralyze most combat teams before they could complete their mission." "That's why we're going in with a human strike team," Rodriguez replied. "Psychological warfare doesn't work on troops who think fear is just another tactical consideration. The mission launch took place 12 hours later with a combined force of human Marines and Alliance technical specialists. Kethva found himself assigned to the operation as both liaison and observer, a role that terrified him more than anything. He had experience during the space battle. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Williams led the strike team through the breeding facility's outer defenses with tactics that seemed designed to give maximum psychological impact to any watching enemy forces. Instead of using stealth insertions or long-range bombardment, the humans announced their presence with explosive charges that carved a direct path through the facility's organic walls. "We want them to know we're coming," Williams explained as they advanced through corridors lined with pulsing biomass. "Scared enemies make more mistakes than confident ones." The facility's interior defied description in any language that Kethva's species had developed. The walls were alive, covered in sensory organs that tracked their movement while secreting fluids that his scanner identified as various digestive enzymes. The floor beneath their feet pulsed with a rhythm that suggested a massive heart somewhere. Deeper in the structure, Sergeant First Class Tony Garcia led the point team through chambers filled with partially formed bioships in various stages of development. The humans showed no signs of the paralyzing disgust that Kethva felt when observing the organic machinery that converted captured beings into swarm components. "Target acquisition chamber is 200 meters ahead," reported Private First Class Kelly Adams from her position at the advanced sensor array, showing multiple large bioforms in active status. The humans began preparing equipment that Kethva recognized as capture gear rather than weapons. They intended to take living swarm specimens out of a facility designed to process organic matter into enemy assets. The tactical insanity of the operation was matched only by the calm efficiency with which the human troops prepared to execute it. The first encounter with active swarm bioforms took place in a chamber the size of a cathedral. Massive creatures that looked like walking organic factories turned toward the intruding humans with movements that radiated predatory hunger. These were not the space-adapted bioships they had fought earlier, but ground-based variants designed specifically for processing organic material into useful components. The humans opened fire with weapons that Kethva had never seen before. Instead of kinetic rounds or energy beams, they deployed what appeared to be modified capture nets reinforced with metallic fibers. The bioforms found themselves entangled in restraints that tightened automatically when they struggled, effectively neutralizing creatures that had been designed to be unstoppable killing machines. "Tensile wire nets with neural disruptors," Garcia explained as they secured their first living specimen. "The more they fight, the tighter the restraints get, and the disruptors prevent them from coordinating their adaptive responses." The capture process continued through chambers that contained increasingly specialized bioforms. The humans demonstrated a disturbing familiarity with swarm biology, targeting specific neural clusters and motor functions with precision that suggested extensive prior study. They moved through the facility like exterminators who understood their prey better than the prey understood itself. Private Second Class Lisa Thompson volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission when they discovered an active processing chamber. The room contained what appeared to be a digestive system large enough to consume an entire ship, currently working to break down captured Alliance personnel into component materials for bioship construction. "Someone needs to get sensor readings from inside the processing system," Thompson announced. "We need to understand their conversion methodology if we want to develop effective countermeasures." Kethva watched in horror as the human soldier allowed herself to be partially consumed by the organic processing system while maintaining communication with the strike team. Her final transmissions provided detailed analysis of digestive enzymes, neural pathways, and conversion processes even as the biomass began breaking down her equipment and protective gear. "Thermal charge is armed," Thompson reported from inside the creature's digestive system. "Recommend immediate evacuation to safe distance." The explosion that followed provided not just the destruction of a major processing facility, but also crucial intelligence about swarm biology that no previous mission had been able to gather. Thompson's sacrifice gave them understanding of enemy vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future engagements. What disturbed Kethva most was the human reaction to their teammate's death. There was grief, but it was mixed with satisfaction. At the tactical intelligence gained and immediate planning for how to use Thompson's discoveries against other swarm facilities. They mourned her loss while celebrating the advantage her sacrifice had provided. The strike team extracted their captured specimens and intelligence data while the facility's automated defenses finally began responding to their presence. The retreat through collapsing organic corridors while carrying living bioforms demonstrated human capabilities that Kethva was beginning to recognize as fundamentally different from any other species he had encountered. They did not just fight their enemies. They studied them, captured them, and learned to become more effective predators than the predators themselves. The intelligence gathered from the breeding facility led to the most terrifying discovery in the recorded history of galactic warfare. The captured swarm bioforms revealed under interrogation that they were not the primary threat. They were scouts and advance forces for something much larger that dwelt in the space between galaxies, something that had been consuming entire civilizations for millions of years. Kethva stood in the research laboratory aboard the UES Defiance as human scientists worked with living swarm specimens in ways that violated every ethical guideline his species had developed for dealing with sentient beings. The humans showed no hesitation in dissecting conscious bioforms while they screamed through psychic emanations that left Alliance personnel physically sick. The neural pathways indicate a hive consciousness, reported Dr. Sarah Phillips, the lead xenobiologist assigned to the project. Individual bioforms are essentially limbs of a much larger entity that exists outside our local galactic cluster. Captain Rodriguez studied the research data with the same methodical approach she applied to all tactical problems. The revelation that the Void Swarm was merely the advance guard for an intergalactic predator did not seem to disturb her any more than learning about a new weapons system might affect other commanders. "How long before the primary force arrives?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was already formulating plans for dealing with a threat that dwarfed anything the galaxy had ever faced. "Based on the specimen's memory patterns, we estimate 18 months," Dr. Phillips replied. "The entity they serve consumes entire galactic clusters, leaving nothing but empty space in its wake." The Alliance fleet commanders who received this intelligence responded with predictable despair. Admiral Veltar immediately began planning evacuation routes to neighboring galaxies, while other leaders discussed negotiating surrender terms with an enemy that had never shown interest in anything other than complete consumption. The humans had a different reaction entirely. Admiral Rivera arrived from Earth with the largest human fleet ever assembled, over 200 vessels carrying weapons and personnel that had never been deployed outside the Sol system. The ships were different from the ones Kethva had observed earlier, larger and more heavily armored, with hull configurations that suggested they were designed for extended combat operations in hostile environments. "We're going hunting, Admiral," Rivera announced during the combined fleet briefing. "The swarm's primary consciousness exists in a bioship approximately the size of our moon. We're going to track it down and kill it." The plan that emerged from human strategic planning sessions was so audacious that Alliance commanders initially refused to believe it was serious. The humans intended to use the captured swarm specimens as tracking devices, following the psychic connection back to its source while simultaneously developing weapons specifically designed to kill something that large. Lieutenant Commander Paul Davis volunteered to lead the deep space reconnaissance mission that would locate the primary swarm entity. His fleet of modified destroyers carried experimental weapons that pushed the boundaries of what human engineering could accomplish in the 18 months they had available. The tracking mission launched 3 months later with Kethva aboard. Davis's flagship, the UES Vengeance. The ship had been modified with biological components harvested from captured swarm specimens, creating a hybrid vessel that could navigate the psychic connection while remaining undetected by the enemies. Sensory systems. The journey to the galactic rim took them through regions of space that no Alliance vessel had ever explored. They traveled beyond the influence of normal stellar formation into the empty void where the primary swarm entity waited with patience that spanned geological ages. When they finally detected their target, the sensor readings defied comprehension. The bioship was indeed the size of Luna, a living creature so massive that it generated its own gravitational field. The surface was covered with launch bays that could deploy millions of scout vessels, while the interior showed organ systems capable of processing entire star systems into useful materials. "It's been waiting out here for over 60 million years," Davis reported to Admiral Rivera through the quantum communication array. "The specimens we captured are just antibodies it sent ahead to soften up resistance." The human response to discovering a threat of this magnitude was characteristically direct. They began planning the largest military operation in their species' history. An assault designed not just to destroy the primary bioship, but to eliminate the threat permanently. The final battle plan required something that no sane military commander would consider. 40 human vessels would be converted into kinetic kill vehicles, their crews volunteering for suicide missions that would involve flying directly into the creature's vital organs, while detonating fusion reactors enhanced with exotic matter that human physicists had been developing in secret. "You're talking about 40 ships' worth of personnel," Kethva said to Davis as they reviewed the battle plan. "Over 12,000 human lives sacrificed to kill one enemy. 12,000 volunteers who understand that their sacrifice might save trillions of lives across hundreds of worlds," Davis replied. "The mathematics are pretty clear from our perspective." The assault began with conventional attacks designed to penetrate the bioship's outer defenses. Human vessels deployed every weapon they had developed during their brief but intensive war against the swarm, creating breaches in the creature's hull that allowed the suicide ships to penetrate into its interior structure. Kethva observed the final phase of the battle from the bridge of Admiral Rivera's flagship as 40 human destroyers disappeared into the massive bioship's body cavity. The crews of these vessels continued transmitting tactical data and encouragement to their comrades even as they guided their ships toward critical organ systems deep within the creature's anatomy. "This is Commander Martinez in the Youth Thunder," came one final transmission. "We've reached what appears to be a central nervous system. Beginning fusion reactor overload sequence. It's been an honor serving with all of you." The chain reaction began at the creature's neural center and spread throughout its body as 40 fusion explosions created cascading failures in biological systems that had functioned for millions of years. The bioship's death throes sent shock waves through space that could be detected from neighboring star systems, but as the massive creature died, it transmitted something that chilled Kethva to his core. A final psychic scream that carried across the void to others of its kind. A death song that would bring more of these entities to investigate what had killed their scout. The humans had won the battle, but they had also announced their presence to predators that measured their lifespans in geological ages. 6 months after the destruction of the primary swarm entity, Kethva found himself preparing to return to Zephyrian space with a tactical report that would fundamentally change how his people understood their place in the galaxy. The humans had done more than simply defeat an enemy that had terrorized civilized space for decades. They had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about evolution, survival, and the nature of intelligent life itself. The debriefing session with Admiral Rivera took place aboard the UES Defiance, which had been designated as the flagship for humanity's new role as Guardians of the Galactic Rim. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to Admiral and given command of the defensive fleet that now patrolled the empty spaces beyond known star systems, watching for signs of more entities like the one they had destroyed. "Your people will want to know what makes us different," Admiral Rivera said as they reviewed the tactical data that Kethva would carry back to Alliance space. "The question isn't why we're willing to fight these things. The question is why we're able to stop when the fighting is over." The distinction was important in ways that Kethva was only beginning to understand. The humans had shown themselves capable of escalating violence to levels that would be considered monstrous by any civilized standard. They used weapons of mass destruction with casual efficiency, sacrificed their own people without hesitation, and approached warfare with a systematic brutality that had proven more effective against the swarm than centuries of sophisticated alliance military doctrine. But they had also shown restraint when dealing with their allies and compassion for the civilians they protected. The same species that had fed living enemies to engineered bacteria also risked their lives to evacuate Alliance personnel from compromised positions and shared their medical supplies with wounded Zephyrian crew members. We're not monsters, Admiral Rodriguez explained during Kethva's final briefing aboard her ship. We just understand that sometimes you have to become the monster to protect innocent people from worse monsters. The tactical analysis that Kethva had compiled over his months with the human fleet painted a picture of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species should conduct military operations. The humans approached combat not as a clash between opposing forces, but as a problem-solving exercise where the goal was to identify the most effective method for eliminating threats regardless of conventional limitations they escalated through. Levels of violence that other species reserve for only the most desperate circumstances, treating weapons of mass destruction as standard tactical options rather than last resorts. Their willingness to sacrifice individual units for strategic advantages meant they could achieve objectives that more cautious commanders would consider impossible. Most disturbing to Alliance military theorists was the human approach to acceptable casualties. Where other species calculated losses in terms of economic cost and strategic value, humans seemed to measure sacrifice in terms of lives saved rather than lives lost. They would trade 40 ships and 12,000 crew members to eliminate a threat that could consume billions of civilians without considering it an unacceptable exchange rate. The final entry in Kethva's report addressed the question that would haunt Alliance leadership for years to come. If humans were capable of such systematic violence against their enemies, what prevented them from turning that same ruthlessness against their allies when conflicts of interest arose? The answer came from an unexpected source during his last conversation with Sergeant Major Helen Brooks, one of the few human soldiers who had survived the entire campaign from the first encounter with the swarm through the final assault on the primary entity. You want to know what keeps us from being the bad guys, she said as they stood in the observation deck watching human patrol ships begin their endless watch of the galactic rim. It's the same thing that let us beat the swarm when your people couldn't. Kethva waited for her to continue, sensing that her answer would be crucial to his understanding of everything he had witnessed. We choose our battles, Brooks explained. Every other species we've encountered fights because they have to, because they're defending their territory or their resources or their way of life. We fight because we decide that something needs to be fought. The distinction seemed subtle, but carried implications that Kethva found both reassuring and terrifying. Humans were not driven to violence by instinct or necessity but by conscious choice. They could escalate to any level of brutality required by the situation because they retained the ability to choose when to stop. The swarm couldn't be negotiated with or reasoned with or avoided, Brooks continued. They were a threat that had to be eliminated completely or they would eventually consume everything, so we eliminated them completely. She turned to face Kethva directly, her expression carrying the same calm certainty that he had observed in human personnel throughout the campaign. But you're not a threat that needs to be eliminated. You're allies who ask for help. That makes all the difference in how we choose to treat you. The transport ship that carried Kethva back to Alliance space passed through the outer defense perimeter that human ships now maintained at the edge of known civilization. The patrol vessels, he observed, were different from the ones that had responded to the original distress call months earlier. These were larger and more heavily armed, designed for extended operations in the empty spaces where worse things than the swarm might be lurking. Admiral Rivera had shared intelligence suggesting that the entity they had destroyed was not unique, that other predators of similar scale existed in the void between galaxies. The The human response to this revelation was characteristically direct. They positioned themselves between civilized space and the darkness beyond, accepting responsibility for defending species that could never adequately repay the debt they owed. As his transport entered Zephyrian space, Kethva began composing the final section of his report. The document would need to explain not just what humans were capable of doing, but what they chose to do with those capabilities. The distinction between ability and intention would determine how the Alliance responded to their new relationship with humanity. The last entry in his tactical analysis contained a single line that summarized everything he had learned during his time with the human fleet. It was a quote from human military doctrine that Admiral Rodriguez had shared during one of their conversations about the nature of warfare and protection. "We do not fight because we are fearless. We fight because fear is not enough to stop us." The report concluded with Kethva's recommendation that the Alliance accept humanity's offer to serve as guardians of galactic space, not because they had no choice, but because they had found protectors who understood the difference between necessary violence and senseless brutality. The humans would watch the darkness at the edge of known space, waiting for worse things than the swarm to emerge from the void between stars. And when those threats appeared, they would respond with the same systematic escalation that had eliminated the previous enemy, choosing their battles and their methods with the cold calculation of predators who had learned to hunt the hunters.